Hey there. So a little bit ago, I went through Harry Potter book 7 one more time via the audiobook. That's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the one where Harry and friends drop out of school to go find all the Horcruxes so they can finish off our good friend Voldemort before he takes over the world and subjects everybody to his despotic cruelty. I mean, piece of cake, right? But anyway, so I just really enjoyed going through the book this last time, going through the Jim Dale audiobook version of it. And it's a lot of fun, but also a very, very serious and much more mature tone throughout, which really makes it engrossing and gives it a kind of depth and seriousness that really stands out. But as I started the book this last time going through it, I was kind of thinking to myself how this story, for much of the book, is so particularly a story about grief. And I noticed that in particular because of how the story starts. I mean, so yes, there's that first introductory scene with Voldemort and his Death Eaters doing all their nasty old Death Eatery things. But that scene almost feels like it's kind of there as like a reverse cliffhanger, kind of like a pre-intro to remind us just how bad things are, how deadly, how dangerous things are, how high the stakes are from where we left things off at the end of the last book. But just as soon as that scene gets out of the way, we find ourselves immediately in this very slow and kind of brooding scene, which is basically just Harry in this miserable, quite cranky, possibly mildly depressive mood, kind of just shifting around in his bedroom, experiencing memories and a whole lot of grief, sadness, and anger. So I guess that's kind of where the theme first shows up, right there at the beginning of the book with that really slow contemplative scene. And it's almost like, well, if you don't feel the weight of it there, which you probably will, but if you don't, you'll get plenty of more chances before the end because it's kind of like it is the ebbing flavor that flows throughout the rest of the book. Now, of course, there's plenty of other things going on in book 7 other than grief. And it's not like the characters are, going around having deep philosophical conversations about grief or anything like that. The book is certainly about relationships and forgiveness and courage and character and greed and love and all that kind of good stuff. But that being said, much of book 7 does tell a story that is highly impacted by grief and reflective about grief. And starting with that beginning scene in Harry's bedroom, it really gives the reader an opportunity to experience and to settle into the heavy and oppressive burden of loss and emptiness and the despair of asking questions and getting no good answer back. Harry's questions about Dumbledore, for example, that's one thread that goes throughout the whole book. Harry's always asking himself why he didn't tell or ask this or that to Dumbledore, or why Dumbledore didn't tell or ask such and such to him, or maybe like what Dumbledore would do if he was here, or why Dumbledore didn't do such and such, back when he could, and when it seems like he should have done that or he could have done that. And so Harry's got all these questions, and he doesn't tend to get answers to those questions. And I guess the questions are all the more painful because he's also questioning on a more fundamental level. He's questioning whether Dumbledore was even a good person. Because the moment Dumbledore died, everybody around is going unhatching all this dirt on Dumbledore, all the dirt they can think of. And then Harry is kind of realizing in this sinking, grief-filled despair, he's realizing that he can't tell the difference between the truth and the lie. You could say that aspect is the tragic disruption of the already difficult process of grief that Harry would have to face. The ordinary grieving process, which would be there anyway, is interrupted, even in this earliest stage, is interrupted by this clanging dissonance of uncertainty over who Dumbledore even was. The story does go on, of course. We get to move forward from that heavy, ponderous moment in his bedroom at the Dursleys. But it's almost like moving forward from there is just the cue to bring in the next dose of loss and grief for poor Harry. Because on Harry's trip back to the Burrow on Hagrid's motorbike, here goes loss again. Hedwig has been with Harry since the first book. And even though Hedwig is just an animal, he's got a lot of symbolic significance because he represents Harry's entrance into wizardhood back in book 1. He represents Harry's connection to his friends while he's stuck with the bullying Dursleys. And also, let's just be honest, we all get attached to anything that we're interacting with, taking care of day after day. So while Harry and Hagrid are running for their lives, and then Hedwig is suddenly gone and dead, Harry doesn't know how to take it. Because you can't lose Hedwig. Hedwig stays the same no matter what else is going wrong around you. Hedwig can't get killed. That's not how life works. But maybe in this particular chapter of Harry's life, maybe that just is how life works. Maybe this part of his life is by its very nature a succession of loss. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's comment. I think it was in one of his Narnia stories where I think it was the magician's nephew, but I'm not sure. But he made this passing comment as the narrator. The narrator said, sometimes it seems like life just starts going badly and then suddenly everything starts going badly and won't stop. And then sometimes life just seems to start going well. And then to our surprise, suddenly everything goes well and won't stop. But anyway, that bit there just kind of always stuck in my memory. But I guess in that kind of sense, you could kind of suggest maybe this is just kind of that period in Harry's life where it feels like and looks like and seems like everything is going all at once, as though that's just going to have to be life and it's never going to stop, as though loss and pain and emptiness are all that he's ever going to have ever again. Because by the time we finally get a quiet moment to get used to Hedwig being gone, by that time, when we're in safety under the enchanted protection of the burrow, well, then we find out that Mad Eye was killed, who was quite literally the most invincible, stereotypically tough as nails kind of character, probably in the entire series. He's just that one kind of character that makes you just feel safe just because he's around. And then suddenly he's just dead. He's just gone, just like that. And it's not just Harry, but everybody who's got to face that and grieve it and grieve that loss together. One thing that's kind of ironic, I suppose, in this early part is that Harry probably feels more gut level grief in a certain way for Hedwig, simply because he's actually been interacting with Hedwig every day, in the sense that it's the kind of loss that puts Harry's sense of mundane reality off balance, his sense of normal life. It knocks that off balance. Whereas the loss of Mad Eye, even though Harry at this point didn't interact with Mad Eye as much, but the loss of Mad Eye is the kind of grief that reverberates throughout all of Harry's social circles, leaves this aftertaste of fear and emptiness and maybe a little bit of despair, particularly because of how it relates to the future and to the hopes of the Order of the Phoenix. After that, we do get a bit of a break from loss in our tragic, horrible, monstrous story here. We've got wounded characters are able to be healed enough to get back to life. There's even a wedding to be had, which you could say, I suppose, is a stereotypical inverse of a funeral. And maybe that was an intentional story element in that sense, to be the stereotypical inverse of a funeral, the celebration of joy in life instead of the grieving of its loss. Harry and his friends drop out of Hogwarts to go on their quest for the Horcruxes, which also involves Harry leaving Ginny, which is also a certain kind of loss. But that particular aspect of loss really took place at the end of the last book when he made that decision and told her about it, and it was all, painful and necessary and all that. Now, there's one particular interesting moment that stood out to me going through thinking about this theme. And this particular bit is a little further on in the book from the last part I referred to. This is after they're out in the wilderness and he's had his blow up with Ron, if you remember, where Ron ends up leaving and it seems like he's never going to come back. And so now it's just Harry and Hermione. And after all, at this point, how could Ron come back? Because they are kind of out in the middle of nowhere to hide from everybody after all. And then of all the unpredictable things that could happen next, Harry's Phoenix wand ends up broken and completely unusable, unrepairable. And kind of like Hedwig, Harry's wand has been with him since book one, ever since his life changed when he became a wizard. So it's one of those things, once again, that you can't lose. And if you do lose it, you're going to be feeling that loss every day and every moment of every day. And there's this one line, and I don't have the quote, but there's this line where Harry says to himself something to the effect of, so I've lost Dumbledore. Now I've lost Ron. Now I've lost the Phoenix Wand. What am I going to lose next? Am I just going to keep on losing forever? And like I said, that's not a quote, but the general sense of it was those key points that he lost Dumbledore, he lost Ron, lost the Phoenix Wand, and it's kind of like, is this just life now? Am I just going to lose everything forever? And of course, that succession that he listed, Dumbledore, the Ron, and then the wand, those were listed in that paragraph because those are the things that he has on his mind at the time. But as careful readers, or in my case, audiobook listeners, as careful readers, we could expand that list to include plenty of other things that Harry is losing. He's lost Hedwig and Mad Eye. He's lost his final year at Hogwarts. He's probably lost Ginny because at this point, all things being equal, he did basically give her final goodbye. And he's definitely lost his sense of safety and belonging as a student with something of a normal life at school. And then, probably most of all at this point, he's lost his sense of hope that he can do and be what Dumbledore expected of him. So those are some of the scenes that stand out in my mind when I think of the themes of loss and grief in Harry Potter Book 7. The questions and pain over Dumbledore remains a theme and a thread throughout the book, and these other examples early on really set the tone. And then near the end of the book, in the battle for Hogwarts, we shockingly lose even more people we never thought we could lose, starting with Fred, or I forget if it was Fred or George, but one of those. And then Lupin and Tonks, who we definitely thought could not die. And then let's not forget about Snape, who died at Voldemort's hand, but was able to use his dying breath to give Harry the truth and give Harry a reason to grieve his loss. And let's not forget about Dobby, who died quite a bit earlier than the battle scene. So we're going back a little bit. But Dobby, whose burial was this really meaningful moment of deeply expressive significance for Harry, as Harry chose to dig the grave manually, like a sweating muggle, instead of, taking a magical shortcut, which would cheat him out of the symbolic significance of hard work and the grief-stricken, angry sadness as he's digging that grave, and especially of the honor for Dobby that all of those elements of him digging that grave would be pointing toward, reflecting. And I guess for a book with so much grief and loss, I guess it's quite fitting that the book also brings up a pile of related topics, such as death in the afterlife, fear of death, personal sacrifice, etc., all which tie in very neatly and beautifully with the theme of loss and grief, and with the feeling that you may get when seeing people you love disappearing one after another, like what Harry's experiencing. Harry does get to see Lupin and his parents near the end via the resurrection stone, if you remember. And it's left a little ambiguous if this is really them he's seeing, since they say that they are, quote unquote, part of Harry, and that's why the Death Eaters aren't going to be able to see them. But then after that, Harry gets his near death experience where he actually dies and goes to King's Cross Station, which is a fitting metaphor because in real life, it's common in deathbed experiences where the dying may use expressions like a train coming or some kind of travel metaphor. But anyway, so he dies and goes to King's Cross Station and sees Dumbledore. And even though Dumbledore does suggest that there's some kind of subjectivity to what Harry's perceiving in terms of the place, it's also quite clearly supposed to be that this is a real experience, and without a doubt, this is the real and quite deceased Dumbledore. What this scene isn't is a cheap gimmick to bring Dumbledore back into the story, because Dumbledore is not coming back. Rather, I think this is a culmination of the author's exploration of the theme of grief, allowing Harry not only to get some answers, but also for Harry to come to recognize something about the nature of death, grief, and loss, which will help him not only to complete his grieving process for Dumbledore, but also to be in a better position to live forward into a life in which grief and loss are going to have to continue to be there, because that's how life works. I wonder if part of the reason this book ended up leaning so heavily on these themes of grief and loss, I wonder if part of that just kind of naturally emerged from how the prior book ended, with Dumbledore dying. Because Dumbledore was one of those characters that, just by virtue of the nature of fiction, tends to seem immortal. Because in most fiction, there are certain characters that just won't die just because they're so essential to the story. It would be difficult, for example, to imagine a version of the Harry Potter series in which, let's say at the end of book 4, Hermione was strangled to death by an enchanted plant and she was gone for good. Or let's say Ron and Harry get roasted to death by a flaming dragon's breath, never to be heard from again. And let's be honest, in a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, when a truly important character does die, such as Gandalf or such as Mr. Spock from Star Trek, we kind of look on suspiciously, just in case he's going to come back to life pretty soon. And maybe that's part of why a lot of sci-fi and fantasy has such a levity and pleasantness about it. We don't take it too seriously. We're there to have fun, and things tend to turn out in the direction of the more fan-friendly, flawlessly feel-good kind of direction. But here in Harry Potter Book 7, we are several steps away from that lighthearted bewilderment flavor that we got in the initial entries of the series, books 1, 1, 2, and 3, or book 1 particularly. We're several steps away from that. And as Harry comes toward the end of his teenage years here, the audience is now allowed to taste the bitterness of real life. And when Dumbledore dies, it's not because it was time to kill off a character. It's because when you mature out of the younger parts of your life, sometimes that's when you start to notice terrible things that happen. And this teenage Harry is the kind of Harry that sits on his bed in a disoriented daze with bits of lethargy and bolts of anger ebbing and flowing as he reads newspaper articles filled with part sadness and part lies. This Harry who kind of aimlessly feels around the bottom of his suitcase to remember things long past, as he's realizing he's just going to have to sit there with all of his unanswered questions and with all of his deep, heartfelt longings that can't be satisfied. Now, it's not like grief is a new concept for Harry Potter or death, because if you remember at the end of book 5, The Order of the Phoenix, the same topic was discussed at some length near the end of that book with the death of Sirius. Incidentally, that book was the first of what you might think of as the teenage Harry Potter books. And with Harry's coming into those maturing years, with that comes the audience's introduction to the pain and emptiness associated with loss and grief. And it's because we remember Harry's desperate moments following the death of Sirius, it's because of that that we are able to sink in with Harry, sink into these moments of sadness and finality as Harry reflects on the life of Dumbledore at the beginning of this book. Because after Sirius died, Harry, if you remember, they had to hold him back from tearing after Sirius through that curtain because Sirius had to still be alive just through that curtain. If you just let go of me and let me go. And then later on, once the action finally settles down and things are back to normal, he's still holding on to his last shred of hope when if you remember, he runs over to nearly headless Nick in hopes that maybe in this magical, wondrous Hogwarts world, maybe in this kind of world, the dead can just come back as ghosts. Maybe in Fantasyland, we don't have to deal with death and loss and grief. Maybe in magical fiction, like in sparkling fairy tales, maybe we don't have to feel the deepest and heaviest of pain. But the answer ended up being clear. Sirius would never come back as a ghost. Just like later on in book 7, Harry says, I think it's to Ron, he says, when asked, he says, Dumbledore would never come back as a ghost. Because even in Magic Land, grief can't be overcome by the cheating whims of a giddy story writer bringing dead protagonists back to life. If Sirius is dead, he's dead. And the next step is not going to be to find some happy ending, but to cry until the bottom of your heart has fallen out. Incidentally, as well, you can kind of tie this in with the theme in book 7 of the resurrection stone as being an unhealthy tool. If you remember in the end, right at the very end near the end of the book, Harry ends up discarding the stone because he realizes that just like no self-respecting person would come back as a ghost, in the same way, to use this magic stone to bring back shadows of the people you miss is far more destructive than it is good. So it seems like the idea is we're not going to find peace by trying to defy the order of things, but instead by finding our place and accepting what we can't change. So anyway, after all the book 5 stuff about Sirius, now at the end of book 6, where Dumbledore dies and they have the funeral, I think, at the end of the book there. And now here at the beginning of book 7, now that Dumbledore is dead, because of what happened with Sirius, we actually have the ability to feel that heaviness. Because as much as we were startled at his death, or at least I certainly was my first time going through it, I was completely in shock and disbelief. But once the time has passed and he's been buried and we're spending a quiet moment with Harry in his bedroom reflecting and feeling sad here in book 7, well, now it can actually sink in. And I think that kind of emotional aspect and how these things are portrayed in this book does make an important contribution to the series, because loss is one of those non-negotiables in life, and grief is so often breezed over in fantasy and sci-fi. Harry never expected and is not going to easily get over the loss of the venerable and invincible Dumbledore, one of the most important people in his whole life. And we kind of keep on thinking we see Dumbledore as the story moves forward. Mysterious moments always seem to be suggesting to Harry or others that maybe Dumbledore is still watching out for him, such as an eye looking out of a mirror or a mysterious silver doe in the woods that guides Harry to the sword of Gryffindor. In a way, I suppose, in retrospect, at the end of the book, you could suggest that Dumbledore was watching out for Harry, but in a unique way. Because Dumbledore was certainly completely dead, no longer able to have any influence or effect on anybody. But the watching out for Harry that Dumbledore did was what he did before he died, and his actions lived on. Harry was protected by Dumbledore. He was protected by the decisions Dumbledore made, the actions and commitments, and the consequences Dumbledore set into action beforehand. Actions and decisions and consequences, which in a way kind of gave Harry a connection back to his mentor, as it were, that stretches throughout the whole book. Indirectly, you could suggest that it was actually Dumbledore who enabled the overthrow of the Dark Lord through his earlier choices and actions and influence that no one else could have set into action or got to be happening. You could suggest that it was Dumbledore who really enabled the overthrow of the Dark Lord, even though Dumbledore was long dead and never coming back. As far as grief goes, at the end of the story, it seems that Harry has come to a resolution of his grief. Harry is able to, if you remember at the very end, he's able to be talking to that portrait of Dumbledore without agony, without visible distress about it. And then in the epilogue, Harry, it turns out he named his son Albus, which suggests that the complications to the grieving process that I mentioned earlier on, which we definitely, see, it seems that those complications were eventually resolved, that Harry was able to grieve well and move forward through life while remembering Dumbledore and accepting the reality of his loss and the preciousness of life. On that note, there are definitely aspects of the real life grieving process that are visible throughout the book, which is kind of interesting, even though, of course, the book is far too focused on Harry's mission to be a long form exploration of grief or anything like that. But just for fun, let's think about Harry's stages of grief. The stages of grief that most of us are familiar with go back to the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in 1969. I'm talking about the real world here. Now, since those stages of grief were first articulated, it's been discovered through studies and things like that that people don't predictably move through these stages in any particular order, and people don't even necessarily experience all the stages in the list. So in that sense, we shouldn't necessarily think of them as prescriptive stages, but the list could and is still used by professionals as just a kind of generalization or a set of suggestions of what kinds of things someone may and people do find themselves experiencing in some order. So these stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Denial, that first one, is something we see in a variety of ways throughout the story. The inability to accept, believe, or emotionally acknowledge the reality of what has happened. We see this when Harry keeps trying to rush after Sirius in book 5, after Sirius fell to his death through the curtain. Harry is insistently refusing to accept the fact that Sirius died because Sirius can't be dead. And coming to accept this fact takes time. And to Harry, it's like accepting the impossible. And then as far as denial goes, some things that Harry doesn't do, he never pretends he doesn't care or pretends he isn't impacted by the loss. And then over time, he is able to face the reality of loss and accept his feelings about the tragic reality. Now, in book 7, after Dumbledore's death, and then after the funeral that took place in book 6, it seems like we come into this book 7, with Harry already having come to accept and having come to openly face the reality of the death of Dumbledore as something final, something significant. However, he does keep kind of seeing Dumbledore. He sees the eye in the mirror, which partly would be because Aberforth looks a bit like Dumbledore, but maybe also there's a part of Harry that kind of wants to hang on to a hope that Dumbledore's not really dead. Similarly, at a point remarkably far, way on through the book, there's a point where Ron is insisting again and again that that doe must be from Dumbledore. So while these last two bits here, they probably don't fit into the actual category of denial in the typical sense, but I think it's interesting just how the book as a whole is, and this kind of reflects how the book really involves a journey of growth as each character is increasingly having to acknowledge, having to repeatedly re-accept this seeming impossibility, the death of Dumbledore. And then the opposite of that, this constantly having to re-accept it or, accept it in the first place. The opposite of that is the temptation That's very human, very normal for somebody in pain, the temptation to minimize, ignore, downplay, or disbelieve that which is far too painful to face. For all of us, it's difficult to accept the reality of any deep and painful loss. And one normal response is to either pretend it's not a big deal, pretend it doesn't bother you, or pretend it hasn't actually happened. Like with Harry, many find that the grieving process includes having to come to the point of recognizing and allowing oneself to believe the truth about what has happened and admit how much it hurts. Anger, the second stage, is definitely something we see bubbling up throughout both books 5 and 7. In the most immediate way, just for the surface stuff, Harry's angry at the people who are holding him back from running after Sirius's body, if I remember right. And then there's his anger at Dumbledore near the end of book 5, which normally I think I've kind of associated that with the PTSD he's been experiencing throughout the book. So he's kind of had this simmering resentment toward Dumbledore for much of book 5. But that angry outburst incident in Dumbledore's office at the end of the book, it does also take place after Sirius's death. So in a way, I suppose we could attribute it to either or both aspects of his experience. But then in book 7, Harry has some unexpected bursts of anger just kind of showing up periodically throughout the book, such as his explosion of anger against Lupin at Grimmauld Place over Lupin walking out on Tonks. And the way the narrator describes it is that Harry didn't know where on earth this was coming from inside of him. And he was startled by his own sudden rage. And then after he calms down and Lupin is gone, Harry kind of says in a quieter voice, he says to Ron and Hermione something like, people shouldn't abandon their kid unless they absolutely have to. Which suggests, I think, that maybe as Harry is quieting down after his outburst, he realizes that his unexpected rage had something to do with other kinds of pain that are kind of percolating and seething inside of him. Part of which would be the loss that he felt from losing his father. And then maybe we could add part of the reason that was so intense at that point would have been in connection with the tragic loss of this other new father figure that he had, Dumbledore. And then these intrusive thoughts that are battering him constantly about who Dumbledore really was because of all this gossip. And then not too long after that is the part where Ron and Harry end up in their merciless shouting match that results in Ron leaving the group because Harry told him to leave, something that both Ron and Harry regret. In several places throughout the later part of the book, Harry finds himself angrily blaming himself or angrily blaming Dumbledore regarding things that should have been done or shouldn't have been done back when Dumbledore was alive. Harry is resentful and angry toward Dumbledore, even in contexts where the reader might kind of be wondering, how on earth could Harry be mad at Dumbledore? But the reason is because in the torrent of confusing feelings that Harry just doesn't know how to handle, sometimes it's easier to be angry than to just feel empty and defeated and alone. Just like Harry and friends, I think it's helpful for all of us to realize that sometimes what looks like anger or even resentment may have more to do with raging emotions than with intention. When someone with grief or PTSD or anxiety becomes angry at you suddenly, or when you find yourself with raging anger or resentment on the inside that you can't seem to control, sometimes it helps to remember that these kinds of things may be connected more with waves of unprocessed grief than with resentment. That doesn't make anger management any less important, but it does help to realize that these things may not stay forever and may not be quite as connected to truth as they seem to be. Bargaining, the next stage, has to do with trying to do any conceivable desperate measure possible to try to change the situation. So some resources I saw as I did my little Google search here, getting ready for this video, some resources suggest that in a case where the situation is already done, for example, the person's dead, then this stage can also be used to refer to kind of what if thoughts. For example, what if I had done such and such, that kind of thing. So I guess one example of this stage, the bargaining stage, would probably be Harry going to talk to nearly headless Nick. Remember in book 5, he sought out Nick because his mind was just racing for anything and everything that could possibly change the situation. And then he finally grasps at one straw that he thinks could possibly go somewhere. I think you could also suggest that a very similar mental process, or even the same mental process, is what happened when Harry went and saw that mirror that Sirius gave him that he never used to talk to Sirius. And he's regretting his actions. He's blaming himself a little bit for Sirius's death. And then similarly, I think in book 7, no examples come to mind, but it seems like there are places where Harry replays different what if situations, what if suggestions in his mind about how things could have been different if he had done this different or said this different, or if, whatever. So, I think we could all see to some extent how it just kind of makes sense in the face of loss and pain. It makes sense to be experiencing constant thoughts, trying to desperately find some way to make the situation better. And it also kind of makes sense that those thoughts could be for the future, like what if I do this or that, but they could even be things about the past that it's really too late to do anything about. It could be these obsessive thoughts about what if I had done this? What if I had done that? Next, the depression stage. This one is often articulated as occurring after the more intense and unaccepting stages have passed. So another way to put that is because the reality is beginning to sink in, now this causes the grieving person to sink down. It's hard to live life normally when the reality of loss is laying down on you and leaving you in this haze of despair that results from no longer being able to run from your loss, not being able to run from your loss anymore through denial, through anger, through bargaining. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind for Harry for this aspect is that opening scene of book 7 when he's alone in his bedroom, kind of feeling a little down and miserable. You could say that that elements of depressive grief kind of weave in and out throughout much of book 7, but for most of the book, Harry's far too active and far too on mission to be described as depressive in the stronger sense of the word. Maybe part of that is that Harry's sense of purpose, tied up in the mission that Dumbledore gave him, kind of helps keep him out of the depressive state. But maybe his real depressive stage would have been back in that cushion of time between the end of book 6 and the beginning of book 7, that time when Harry was spending all that time by himself at the Dursleys, pretty much stuck in his room a bunch of the time, if I remember right. I think that would probably be the best and fullest example of the depressive stage for Harry. The period where the reality was sinking in, and that resulted in Harry sinking down. And he spent all his time preferring to be alone, spent all his time with low energy, very little motivation, few to no positive feelings or thoughts, that kind of thing. And then there's the acceptance stage, coming to terms with the reality of what happened and finding a place within your reality and within your mind and memory for this very important loss. In the case of Sirius, I guess you could say book 6 and book 7 really take place with Harry on the other side of having accepted the loss of Sirius. He still misses him and wishes he were there, but he's come to terms with it and made sense of what it means as a real and irreversible part of his life. In the case of book 7, with the death of Dumbledore, we see aspects of acceptance from fairly early on in the book. But I think we see the acceptance stage most visibly at the end of the story when Harry is able to dialogue with Dumbledore's portrait without being agitated or distressed by this visible reminder of the person he's lost. He's no longer fighting against the reality, as would be during the denial, anger, and bargaining stages, nor is he crushed by the stifling weight of reality, as it would be in the depression stage, but instead he's able to find a place within his memory and within his present reality for the loved one he has lost. And this becomes even more clear when we see in the epilogue that Harry named his son Albus, making it all the more clear that Harry has come to peace with reality in such a way that he can incorporate his memory and the meaningfulness and significance of that memory into his current reality. Now, one of the weaknesses of the Kubler-Ross stages of grief model is that the stages don't tell you a lot about what should happen or even about what will happen in grief in any kind of predictive way. It's really just kind of a set of descriptions that sometimes happens for people in which most people can relate to some degree. But that's part of why I tend to prefer William Worden's Tasks of Mourning, which is kind of a similar model, which he articulated in 1982. This 4-stage model, I think, is more helpful, from my point of view at least, is more helpful than the traditional stages of grief we just talked about, because it shows you what it looks like to actually be successfully working through grief, or the word he uses is adapting. So let's just go through these real quick. The four tasks of mourning that Worden articulated in his book are: task 1, to accept the reality of the loss; task 2, to process the pain of the grief; task 3, to adjust to a world without the deceased; and task 4, to find a way to remember the deceased while moving forward in life. And now I haven't finished reading Worden's book myself. I'm getting most of my information for this section from an article on therapistaid.com. So Harry's process of growth through grief, regardless of what happens in terms of the 5 Kubler-Ross stages of grief, Harry's process of growth is going to have to include these 4 tasks, according to Worden's model, because these 4 tasks basically constitute the definition of what it means to be successfully transitioning through grieving to your life after grief. So Harry had to accept the reality of the loss. Task 1, he had to accept the reality of the loss of both Sirius and Dumbledore, rather than denying or minimizing it. And this was especially difficult with Sirius. And Harry had to process the pain of the grief. He had to process the pain of grief, putting words to it, expressing his feelings rather than running from his feelings or burying them in anger or hard work. And we see some of that when we see his thoughts and his words in the books. And third task, Harry had to adjust to the world without the deceased. And Worden specifies this could often include internal adjustments, such as changes to identity, external adjustments, such as changes in roles and responsibilities, or what he calls spiritual adjustments, which are changes to your worldview, beliefs, or assumptions. So for Harry, the adjustment task, adjusting to the world without the deceased, it involves taking on Dumbledore's mission without Dumbledore's help, which is a pretty big deal. It involves doing that while trying to process his changing worldview, because ever since Snape unexpectedly killed Dumbledore, ever since that Avada Harry has been really becoming more jaded, disillusioned, and confused than ever before. So he's got to sort out a whole new way of viewing the world. And then this task, the adjusting task, is completed by the end of the book once Harry finishes Dumbledore's mission and he finds answers to his questions and he transitions into his next life stage. And then Harry completed the final task by finding ways to remember Dumbledore and Snape while moving forward in life. So at the end, rather than Albus, the name Albus, rather than that being a bad word for Harry, like Voldemort, did you just say the word? Instead of that, it became one of the best words for Harry. And in Harry naming his son for his former mentor is probably symbolic of the fact that Harry is carrying Dumbledore's influence, Dumbledore's values, his memories of Dumbledore. He's carrying those with him continually as something that he's taking with him that makes him stronger and more at peace, rather than something that he's lugging around, making him weaker and more at turmoil. So those are some thoughts about how Harry's experiences integrate a little bit with the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, as well as Worden's tasks of mourning. Both of those models of grief are helpful to have in mind when you or someone close to you faces loss. And in particular, I think Worden's model is helpful to be able to observe your progress if, let's say, if you're having difficulty transitioning through the grieving process. So, loss and grief in Harry Potter Book 7. It's definitely nice when we're able to pick up a pleasant fantasy story or a pleasant children's book, and then we get to live for a minute in a world where true grief and loss don't reign, like in a lot of pleasant fantasy stories and pleasant children's fiction. But once in a while, I guess every one of us needs to pick up a book like Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows that allows us to slow down with the protagonist and reflect on the life and death of somebody who's dead, somebody we have lost, somebody we're never going to get back, to experience the sadness and emptiness and longing that result from finding that we can't go back and get them, can't go back and ask questions we didn't ask, do things together that we didn't do, get the support or company or interaction with them that we used to get and can't get anymore. I think that's one of the many reasons why Harry Potter Book 7 ends up being a very good, excellent final entry for the series, as well as a healthy and mature reminder for every one of us that facing and experiencing the reality of loss is just part of life. But the pain isn't all that there is to look at. If you want more videos about how sci-fi and fantasy overlap with topics like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. But I'll see you in the next one.